We have to make sure that the politicians are held accountable.
Every administration had the ability to put a ban on asbestos.
When it comes to asbestos, it really is about power, money, and politics.
Good morning. I think we'll get started here. We have a panel of very impressive workers in the area of asbestos-related disease doing very important and groundbreaking work in independent ways, but at the end of the day, it all comes together in a complementary way. So I'm very honored to be on this stage with these well-respected and well-known individuals. So we'll start with John Panza.
Hi, I'm John Panza from Cleveland, Ohio. As you can see, the title is Pedestrian Asbestos Exposure, an Unexpected Curse. I think the easiest way to convey this concept is to do it personally. So I was exposed to asbestos from my father's work. I was exposed from the year I was born, 1973, until approximately 1984, and then some exposure afterward through about 1994. My dad worked at a plant in Cleveland that manufactured brakes and clutches. So you would imagine that that's where the asbestos came from. The company, which I won't name, but it's a major international corporation, they were aware of the asbestos issues in their plants starting in 1936. So going all the way back to 1936, the company was fully aware that there were issues. My father began working for the company in the 1960s. He worked all the way until 1994 when he passed away from small cell lung cancer. My mother had large cell lung cancer in early 2000s and had part of her lung removed. What happened to me was kind of interesting. Like a lot of asbestos exposed kids, I had no idea, and neither did my father for that matter. The company had, and despite the fact that I was born in 1973, after the OSHA regulations and EPA and everything else, my father's company continued to allow workers to cut and abrade brakes and clutches in the plant with absolutely no safeguards at all. In fact, there wasn't even a ventilation system in place. They weren't required, they wore their own clothes. They didn't have required uniforms. There were no showers. There was nothing. So my dad my dad's job, by the way, was he was the shipping and receiving clerk. He drove around the plant picking up the product and putting it into boxes and shipping them. And so my dad received the products before they were abraded, and then he put them back out after they were cut. So my dad more or less drove around the plant all day picking up asbestos fibers. And that's what he did every day, 5 days a week, you know, for over 20 years, almost 30 years. My dad, my dad died in 1994. I was 20 years old. I'm 44 now. I was diagnosed with mesothelioma in 1938, or when I was 38. I'm sorry, when I was 38. And my father, I imagine if he was alive and found out that it was his exposure that had done this, probably would have been, you know, mortified, obviously. And I always come back to my mother. Right after I was diagnosed, my mom's only response was, "We did the best we could for you," which was crushing on so many levels. We grew up very working class. My dad didn't finish high school. He got the best job he could. We worked, living in Cleveland. It was manufacturing. So my own situation was this. When it was discovered I had mesothelioma, I was diagnosed almost by accident. Like a lot of patients, I developed something else. I had a flu in my case. And they scanned me and discovered that I had a ton of fluid surrounding my right lung. They drained me twice, it came back, and although it showed no signs of cancer and they saw nothing, they decided to open me up. I'm lucky that I live in Cleveland and that I live in Cleveland Heights, which is 5 minutes from the Cleveland Clinic. And so if you know anything about the Cleveland Clinic, they're the only hospital that advertises during the Super Bowl. So the clinic doctor, the surgeon that opened me up doing a vat surgery, immediately recognized what it was and closed me up and said, we're gonna assess this. It turned out that he had worked for Dr. Sugarbaker. He trained under Dr. Sugarbaker, so he was very well versed in this. The interesting thing was when he told me a couple days later that it was mesothelioma, I sat down with my wife in his office, and he said to me, or he asked me, he said, when were you exposed to asbestos? And I looked at him, I said, I'm a college professor, I have no idea. Prior to that, I worked in a library, so it's not like I'm, I wasn't in manufacturing, I didn't do anything of that kind. And I went home and I asked my mother, and she said, well, your dad mentioned once, right before he passed away, something about asbestos. And I was like, okay. So we, of course, got a law firm involved. And in my case, we made a decision early on, my wife and I, that we were going to do both the medical and the legal simultaneously. We weren't going to wait. And part of the reason for that is that there was no guarantee I was going to make it. And I am, of course, the best witness for what I'm going through. So when we began the legal process, obviously we had a medical process on the one hand. That one was pretty intense. I had 3 rounds of chemo with the Limta and cisplatin. I had my right lung removed. I had part of my diaphragm removed. I had my pericardium removed. A rib removed as well. That part of the process went, and I had radiation after that, of course. That part of the process went almost all of 2012. At the same time, I was also providing depositions for my legal side. And during that discovery process, we learned that the company not only knew back in 1936, but more or less thumbed their nose at this exposure they were doing with their workers. They knew what they should have been doing, and they weren't doing it. We also discovered during this phase that there were other manufacturers that were suppliers, and those suppliers had provided substantial amounts of product to this company, and over the years had done, they knew what they were providing. Then we discovered something else. The year before I was diagnosed, the state of Ohio passed a law that prevented pedestrian or secondary exposure victims from suing companies in the state of Ohio. In other words, if your company's based out of the state of Ohio and you exposed workers who then exposed their families, those secondary exposure victims could not sue. So we went after, not the company, because we couldn't do that. By the way, the company was also at the same time applying for business residency in Ireland. So they were like Ohio, but not Ohio. It was very frustrating. So instead, we went after the product suppliers. And we were able to trace a direct route to several product suppliers. Now, in doing so, we exposed the fact that they knew what they were doing, and they were fully aware of it. And it was sad because the 2 workers during our trial, the 2 workers my dad worked with who came to speak on his behalf and on the workers' behalf, one of them was on oxygen and the other was missing a part of a lung. And they did not realize that they were working with the product. And they were shocked to find out how much they had actually worked with. So they were taking that home to their families. And my exposure was in my dad's car. My mom didn't drive, so we had 1 car only. And it was at home with my dad's clothing, which was washed with my clothing and my sister's clothing and my mother's clothing. I played in the basement, and that's where my dad's clothes were washed. I helped sort clothing and as a kid. And there's a picture, I couldn't find it, I was going to bring it, but there's actually a picture of my father when I was a baby holding me after work, and he's wearing his work outfit, his work uniform, and he's literally holding me. And so I see that picture and I think to myself, how many other kids, how many other children? So, thank you.